Hello students, welcome to our last lecture in the textbook. So this is over chapter 17, which is one of the least fun chapters in lifespan development because it's about the end of life, death, dying, and grieving. So definitely very important, especially for people who have a loved one who's going to be passing away. So it's good to understand the process. It's good to understand for people who will be going through the process of dying as well. So this is an important aspect of lifespan development, even though it's not necessarily the most fun topic to talk about in all of lifespan. So still very important. So let's jump into it. So we've got the definition of death. So there are some issues in determining death. There have been different definitions or different statutes or different definitions of death over time. So in the past, if someone wasn't breathing, they might have been considered dead. But in more recent time, we know that much of a person's bodily function is still running for a while, even if they've stopped breathing. So that's maybe not a good assessment. So what are some of the assessments we use now to determine when someone has actually officially died? So another examples are blood pressure or rigor mortis are past definitions of death. Now we often use brain death. So that's essentially when all electrical activity, so remember neurons are interacting with each other, so there's electrochemical signals going down the axon. This is a reminder for things you might want to study up for the final exam, for example. So when all that electrochemical activity has stopped for a certain period of time, someone would be said to be brain dead. It is possible, depending on what portions of the brain have stopped functioning, that other areas of the body might still be functioning. So to see brain death, you would see like a flat EEG for a specific period of time, and that would be one criterion of brain death. So this would include higher cortical functions. So that's things like closer to the top end of the brain and especially the prefrontal cortex. So those are the higher cortical functions, the most highly evolved functions, the ones that are where our personality, our memories, those kinds of things are. As well as brain death would also include the lower brain stem functions. So some medical researchers recommend defining death at when the higher cortical functions have stopped. So when that person's self or personality or memories or conscious thought is no longer accessible to them, defining that as dead. And in that kind of case, some of the brainstem functions might still be running. So what areas of the brain might that be referring to? Do you remember the anatomy of the brain enough to say what parts of the brain might be included in the brain stem? So this might be a good thing to review. Go back to that chapter and look over it to see. With that, if the higher cortical functions have stopped, it is still possible for that brainstem to be working. So blood might still be pumping, hearts might still be beating, breathing might still be happening. So a body itself could stay alive without the higher cortical functions. So when do you decide when a person is dead? So that is something a lot of medical researchers have tried to determine. So with that, I thought there was one more slide. I wonder if I accidentally moved it somewhere else. Okay, it is relevant to this material, so if it is jumped forward, that's fine. So advanced care planning is essentially the process of patients thinking about, usually in advance, that's why it's called advanced care, thinking about how to communicate their preferences about their own end-of-life care. So two people who are growing older might do this, even two people in midlife might do this too. So talk about what they want to do as end-of-life care is happening. What kind of procedures are they okay with versus not okay with? How long would they want to be on how many times would they like to be resuscitated? If it looks like their higher cortical functions are gone, how long do they want to wait before pulling the plug? Those kinds of things. So it helps to have that choice. So creating a living will can really help. So that is a legal document that reflects that patient's desires, and that can be really helpful if, say, a patient is in a car accident, is unresponsive. If they have a living will to refer to, that can let the healthcare providers know that, okay, this person does want to be resuscitated or does not want to be resuscitated, does want this kind of care but does not want this kind of care. So that can be really helpful. Otherwise, hospitals essentially just try to do as best they can to keep you alive, or should be doing as best they can just to keep you alive. That's kind of their default, is keep people alive, help them get better. But if that's not what you want, then a living will helps them know that. So advanced directives indicate whether any kind of life-saving procedure should or should not be used when death seems imminent. So this reminds me of the show Upload. I recently watched that on Amazon, and the whole crux of that is a person's consciousness is uploaded to a computer program, into an afterlife program. It's a funny video, but it was clear that that main character did not, I mean, he was fairly young, so don't blame him. He did not have an advanced care plan. So he didn't really get to make a choice until right there he was told, hey, you're about to die, do you want to get your consciousness uploaded? So there's kind of a funny connection. I think we need some of those funny connections when we're talking about death, dying, and end-of-life care. But let's watch a little video that goes into a little more detail on these living wills and other kinds of advanced directives, because there's more than just one type.
Directives. Patients have a right to take an active role in their own health care. Unfortunately, there are times, such as sudden illness or an accident, when this is not possible. Advanced care planning, under the Patient Self-Determination Act, PSDA 1990, gives a patient his right to make determinations regarding their medical care in advance, based on personal values, attitudes, illness, and death. Patients have a right to make medical decisions regarding their treatment, appoint an agent to speak on their behalf when incapacitated, determine or refuse their medical treatment and care. Two commonly used advanced directives are living will and power of attorney. The living will. A living will tells medical professionals and your family which medical treatments you want to receive or refuse, and under what conditions. There are two parts. In Part 1, you are asked to provide instructions concerning your future health care. In Section B and C, you may state the circumstances in which various forms of medical treatment should be provided, withheld, or discontinued. You are asked to give specific instructions regarding two types of life-sustaining measures: artificially provided fluids and nutrition and cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Section D needs additional instructions about your healthcare preferences that are important to you and which may help those concerned with your care to implement your wishes. Section E is about brain death. The state of New Jersey recognizes the irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain as a legal standard for the declaration of death. Section F allows you to indicate your desire to make an anatomical gift and provide instructions for any limitations or special uses for the same. While Part 2 contains signatures and witnesses, generally, a living will does not appoint an agent. However, the witness should be at least 18 years of age or older. Healthcare power of attorney. This form of advanced directive allows you to select a family member or a friend as the decision maker regarding healthcare issues. A healthcare power of attorney pertains to healthcare matters only and allows you to specify in writing the types of care you do and do not want to receive. In Section A, you choose a healthcare representative or agent who will represent you to make decisions on your behalf in accordance with your wishes, as stated in the document. Section B is for designating alternate representatives in case the nominated person is unable, unwilling, or unavailable to act as your healthcare representative. Section C specifies directions to best express your wishes. Section D, E, and F are similar to that of living will, comprising of your signatures and that of the witnesses. By completing an advance directive, you can help avoid potentially destructive disputes, ease decision-making on loved ones, and avoid unwanted medical procedures. In addressing the creation of an advance directive, competent legal counsel should be consulted. Clinic Spectrum, Healthier Business, Wealthier Solutions. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
So while that ended in an advertisement, it actually does a really good job at going into a lot more detail than you really need to know for the class, but enough detail that you might need to know in life in general. So hopefully that was useful for you, and you did get some more information than just the basics, especially if this is something that could be relevant to you anytime soon. Before we go further, during that video I remembered my daughter had wanted me to show you her Lego. She was really proud of it, her little creation. It's kind of cute. She said it was a Minecraft gun that shoots fire, so she really wanted to show me. So now I can show her this video and let her know that I did show it to all my students. So hopefully she's talking to me. You might be able to hear her. She says, "I'm hearing you, Dad." Let's continue. So with that, these are really helpful for family members, for healthcare professionals, to know what it is that you want done near the end of life. So with that, another thing that is relevant is euthanasia. When I first heard this term in childhood, early adolescence, I thought it was 3 words: youth, like young people, in Asia, as in the area of the world. Is Asia a continent? Anyway, youth in Asia is what I first thought it was. So just another little joke to bring some lightness to this discussion. Anyway, what euthanasia actually is one whole word that means the act of painlessly ending the lives of any individual suffering from things like incurable diseases, severe disabilities, chronic, really debilitating illnesses. So if you've ever heard of, say, putting a cat or a dog to sleep, that's essentially euthanasia. And so we're talking about it in the context of humans here. So passive euthanasia is when treatment is withheld. So you just stop treating a patient. So if someone needs a respirator and you remove that, and then they die of natural causes because they weren't able to breathe on their own, that would be passive euthanasia. And so you might have heard of things like pulling the plug. And so passive euthanasia is, as far as I'm aware, legal everywhere. So we've got a little map here. You can go to the Wikipedia article. It's probably more up to date than the book, honestly, on locations where euthanasia is legal versus illegal and passive versus active euthanasia. So it does look like there are some areas where euthanasia is illegal in any way, even passive. So active euthanasia is actively inducing death. So that would be similar to putting a cat down or putting a dog down. So we're talking about this in the context of humans. So usually this involves injecting a lethal dose of a drug. Oftentimes this will be painkillers that are just given at incredibly high doses that induce death, but there are other ways as well. So passive euthanasia is when you withhold treatment, you stop treating them, you stop the life-sustaining machines that a person is on, and then they pass away because of that. Versus active is you actively, deliberately induce death. So how long should life be sustained artificially? So this is a question you might want to ask yourself, especially in relation to thinking about a living will, as well as talking to family members about their own decisions for the end of life. So it is something that's debated by a lot of different people, and it's all right to have different ideas about it as well. So, because really, I don't think there's really a clear answer that applies to everyone in every specific situation. So definitely something to think about, talk about, So think about how long should life be sustained. A really good example that people often talk about, because it was really well known, was Terri Schiavo. Terri Schiavo was kept alive in a vegetative state for 15 years. So where the higher brain cortical functions were not operating, but their body was still living. So with a respirator, other life-saving things, IVs, nutrients, whatnot, their body stayed alive, but they were essentially, their higher brain functions were no longer functioning for 15 entire years. Eventually, they did pass away after passive euthanasia. So is that too long? Is that not long enough? If there's potentially a treatment that might come out in another month or two or a year, is that worth it to keep them in a vegetative state to hope for that kind of cure? So most family members of a patient generally want more care for the patient. They want more to be done. They want more things to be tried to help the person live longer, even if they are in a vegetative state. So when asked and polled and surveyed, most family members want more things to be done. Obviously, you can't really study people who are in a vegetative state. Obviously, that's not a sample you can really access. But when patients are asked before a situation, so saying, assuming this kind of thing happened, what would you want to be done? Most patients, before anything happens, would prefer not to be sustained for very long or undergo a large number of life-sustaining measures. So this is why it's really important to have something like a living will, so you can have your desires met for the end of life. So assisted suicide is another relevant topic here. This is when a patient, under the supervision of healthcare professionals, self-administers a lethal medication and determines when and where to do this. They might, depending on where they live, they might be able to do this at home. They might do it in a hospital or a clinic, something like that. So this is legal in Canada, Switzerland, Colombia, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. Again, do check current laws, because at the time of writing this the first time, it was legal in Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, New Mexico, and California, but that might not be the case in all those places anymore as well. So the U.S. does need to do a better job caring for dying individuals. Death in America really does tend to be more lonely, prolonged, and painful than it necessarily has to be. So generally, people consider a good death involving things like physical comfort, so that would be having things be painless for the end of life, support from loved ones, so the ability to access loved ones, calls, visits, those kinds of things, and some, obviously, infectious diseases, that won't be possible. But in other cases, even if it's the hospital rules might prevent someone from getting support from loved ones that they really need, for example. Acceptance and appropriate medical care as well. So hospice is a program that's focused on making the end of life as free from pain, anxiety, and depression as possible, doing the best job it can to help a person be comfortable and have a little more well-being at the end of life. So hospitals, on the other hand, try to cure illnesses and prolong life. So depending on what you want to be done, hospice might be a better option versus a hospital might be a better option. So this would be something that you might put in a living will. Palliative care is reducing that pain and suffering, helping individuals die with dignity. And this jumps into the Kubler-Ross stages of dying. You might have heard this as Kubler-Ross stages of grief. Interestingly, Kubler-Ross originally did these studies on people who were dying and applied it and was only researching it exclusively for dying, while Kubler and Ross were looking at it only as a process of what people go through when they are dying. Later on, it was applied to grief in general rather than just the process of dying. All right, so with this, people generally know that death is inevitable, and that does allow us to establish priorities and set a structure for life as well as the end of life over time. So 3 areas of concern here: privacy and autonomy in regard to families. So with that, who needs to know what, those kinds of things. Adequate information about physical changes and medication as death approach. So a lot of people don't know what kind of physical changes are going to happen to their body as death approach, and they don't necessarily know what kind of medication will be available. So doctors can do a better job talking about that. There might be resources hospitals can provide to talk about that as well. And then also people face the challenge of motivation to shorten their own life as well, even if there might be things that can be done to help them have an end of life that's a little longer, as well as a little more pleasant and free of pain. So with it, the stages of dying, you've probably heard of these before as the stages of grief. So denial and isolation. That's when a person denies that they're really going to die. And we'll talk about these stages and their structure in a minute. Another stage is anger. So being angry, resentful, envious that you are going to die. Bargaining, trying to develop a hope or a bargaining, maybe with a higher power, maybe with medical professionals, other people around them, to try and get that death postponed in some way. So depression, withdrawing, crying, grieving. Over time, depression might lead to acceptance, but with it, any of these can jump to any one of these stages at any time, essentially. And then the other stage of dying, the last one, is acceptance, where people achieve a sense of peace. So, for initial research on the stages of dying, it seemed like this was kind of the structure. You had denial and isolation. Later on, you're a little angry, then bargaining, or a lot angry. Then you had some bargaining, some depression, and finally acceptance. So when research first began, it seemed like that was the pattern most people were following. But as more research was done, even over the time span of these researchers, they realized that not everybody follows that same exact pattern. So some people do go denial, isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Some people just go straight to acceptance. Some people go depression, acceptance. Some people go depression, anger, denial, anger, denial, anger, depression, acceptance. Right? So this happens with grief as well as with dying. So what more recent research suggests is that while these phases or stages are pretty common for people who are going through grief or through the process of dying, the pattern of going denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, that is not necessarily really common. So as well, people don't have to ever get acceptance for their own death. They don't have to reach an acceptance of their grief. So people can still function throughout life in a healthy way, even if they haven't accepted something that they're grieving about. So there might be other problems associated with suffering from, say, depression because of something that has made them grieve, but those are other related problems. So let's watch a video specifically about that, about these stages of grief and the more updated research, and then we'll come back and talk about this. But just so you know, this is the original phases: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And the original idea was that people went through that pattern, and some therapies tried to help people through that to reach that next stage, and then finally acceptance in the process of their dying or in the process of grief. So again, this started as research on the processes and the experiences of people dying. Over time, people applied it also to grief in general. So let's watch a video about that.
There are a lot of ways to mark the passing of a loved one, but in many modern cultures, once the funeral's over, all that's left are too many flowers and that well-meant soggy casserole your neighbor made for you. Those black mourning dresses that Scarlett O'Hara hated so much have gone out of style. But grief doesn't stop just because the public ceremony of saying goodbye is over. Grief can be hard and lonely, and sometimes it can feel like it'll never end. Psychologists have been trying to figure this out for over a century. And the only good answers they've got are that it's a totally normal process and that it's different for everyone. Bereavement is the technical term that psychologists use to talk about the loss of a loved one by death. Grief is what they call the distress caused by that loss. And when you think about grief in a psychological sense, the first thing that probably comes to mind is the Kubler-Ross model. You might not recognize that name, but it gets talked about a lot in pop culture. You might, for instance, know it from that robot chicken video of a giraffe stuck in quicksand. Basically, the Kubler-Ross model says that we all go through 5 stages as we process our grief. We start off by denying that whatever happened is real, which helps us temporarily deal with it. Next, we get angry, and then we try to bargain our way out of it by making a deal with God or the universe or whatever we believe has the power to change what has happened. When that doesn't work, we experience depression, and finally we get to acceptance. Everything might not be okay, but we've learned to live with it. Even if you haven't taken a psychology class, you're probably familiar with this idea. But you might not know where the model comes from. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist who worked with terminally ill patients. She helped change attitudes about dying and encouraged people to actually talk about death. And rather than just worrying about the salvation of the soul, she was a strong supporter of hospice care, which focuses on making the patient's final days comfortable and keeping them involved in the decisions that affect them. This is all super important stuff that has affected how we think about people who are dying. But she also wrote a book called On Death and Dying. Published in 1969, it was based on interviews with over 200 dying patients. Kubler-Ross was influenced by the work of 2 psychiatrists who proposed that, after a separation or loss, grief was a process that involved 4 sequential stages. So, in her book, she proposed 5 stages we all go through as we come to terms with dying. Not while grieving for someone else, but while dying ourselves. The book sold really well, and the 5 stages took off in the public's imagination. People started applying the stages to grief, even though they weren't meant to describe it. And so, Kubler-Ross and her co-author eventually went back and adapted the same 5 stages so that they made sense for grieving too. But there wasn't really any scientific basis for that adaptation. Of course, we didn't always think of grieving as a pattern of psychological responses. Since death is inevitable, people have been studying grief for a while. In the 17th century, it was believed that too much grieving could be deadly. And in the 19th century, Charles Darwin wrote about grief and noted that monkeys and apes also seemed capable of feeling it. Freud had something to say about it too. In 1917, he proposed that the living had to detach their emotional energy from the dead person and channel it into some other aspect of their lives. He called this grief work. And if people didn't do grief work, he believed they had a much higher risk of developing a psychological illness because of their supposedly pathological grief. Yeah, Freud had a lot of ideas, and they weren't always great. But of all these ideas, the Kubler-Ross model is the one that really stuck around. Some psychologists think that its staying power comes from the fact that it's such a good narrative. Our brains like to organize things, and this model offers a nice, neat progression through 5 well-defined stages, and ultimately has a happy ending. But even though we might like the way it sounds, psychologists nowadays have a few big issues with these 5 stages. First of all, there's a lack of empirical evidence. Many researchers argue that the interviews it's based on weren't conducted with enough scientific rigor. In the years since the book was published, some studies have attempted to replicate and verify the findings. For instance, one study published in 2007 followed 233 people over 3 years, and a 2010 study looked at 614 undergraduates and surveyed them once, all at different points in their grief. Both studies asked the subjects to assess their grief on a scale for disbelief, yearning, anger, depression, and acceptance, and they all had mixed results. The 2007 study found that acceptance was the most common reaction, even right after death. But after averaging all the data over time, the different stages did peak in the order that Kubler-Ross had suggested. The 2010 study found that their results didn't support Kubler-Ross's stage theory, but they didn't completely disprove it either. And how much people were thinking about the loss seemed to influence what they were experiencing more than the passing of time. A second criticism is that the stages don't really have an underlying explanation. There's no hypothesis for why grief would be organized into sequential stages, what function they serve, or how people move from one stage to the next. On top of that, the stages are kind of random, psychologically speaking. Some of them are emotional states like anger and depression, while others are cognitive processes like acceptance and denial. And lastly, researchers have noticed that the Kubler-Ross model seems to create problematic expectations for how grief should be dealt with. The 5 stages can make people expect to experience certain things in a certain order. And if they don't do that, or they don't hit certain stages at all, people might believe that they aren't coping properly. That expectation could also lead to unhelpful support from their social networks or healthcare professionals. But psychologists aren't just critiquing the Kubler-Ross model. They're also trying to figure out new ways to think about grief. There's a ton of research to sift through, but there are a few prominent ideas. The dual process model of grief was proposed in 1999. Developed from other studies on cognitive stress, it suggests that the griever switches back and forth between 2 patterns of behavior, called orientations. In the loss orientation, someone spends time thinking about the person they've lost and what life used to be like. They might look at old pictures or tell stories, and they'll express a lot of emotion about the loss. In the restoration orientation, someone focuses on the changes that need to be made. It's more of a problem-solving state of mind. They might work on establishing a new identity for themselves, or adjusting to do things that the deceased used to do, like doing the dishes after you cooked. What's unique about the dual process model is that it suggests that a person who's grieving switches back and forth between these 2 orientations, until eventually they don't need to think about certain aspects of loss anymore. It's a more flexible model, with room for individual and cultural differences. One of the best-known task-based models of grief was proposed in 2008 by a clinical psychologist with a lot of experience treating people dealing with grief. While this one also doesn't have a ton of empirical evidence, unlike stage-based models, it tries to account more for people going through grief differently. The model says that grieving is a process of engaging in 4 tasks, all in no particular order. Essentially, they include accepting the reality of the loss, processing the pain of the grief, adjusting to the world without the loved one, and finding a lasting connection with them somehow. The task-based model also points out 7 factors that can affect the individual experience of each griever, which may help healthcare professionals understand what someone's going through. These factors are things like their relationship to the deceased, how the person died, or other stress that they're under. Another prominent way of thinking about grief identifies multiple possible grieving processes, reinforcing that it can be very different for different people. This idea started with a 2002 study on 205 people who lost their spouses. The researchers tracked subjects for several years before the death until 18 months afterward, and they used this information to identify 5 common trajectories of grief. The trajectories include common grief, in which the subjects experience a lot of depression at 6 months, but not before the death or at 18 months. There's also depressed improved, in which the subject experienced depression before the death, but had largely returned to normal by 6 months. In chronic grief and chronic depression trajectories, the subject experienced many grief symptoms and high levels of depression at 6 months and 18 months. These were both associated with higher dependence on the spouse before death, but they were distinguishable. In the case of chronic depression, the subject experienced depression before the death as well, and it was associated with marital strife. The most common trajectory was actually resilience, in which a person experiences relatively low and stable levels of depression before and following the loss. Nearly half the subjects experienced this pattern. Now, all these ideas suggest that grief can be different depending on the circumstances and the person, which makes a lot of sense. Grief is really complicated. But there is so much research out there, and some psychologists worry that without a tidy, unified narrative, it will be hard to dislodge the Kubler-Ross model in the general public's mind. The other thing to know is that there can be complications that make grief extra hard to deal with. For example, there's disenfranchised grief, which is what psychologists call grief that isn't generally acknowledged by society. Like when someone you didn't actually know dies, or when you experience a miscarriage. It's not as socially accepted to feel and talk about those kinds of grief, which can make them harder to process. But even typical grief can become a problem. The DSM-5, an evolving guide that professionals use to diagnose mental illness, includes proposed criteria for persistent complex bereavement disorder. These criteria are things like longing for the deceased, intense suffering and preoccupation with the death that causes distress and impairment lasting over a year. So if grief is such a complicated, intense experience, can therapy help? Unfortunately, a 2008 meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin found that most of the time, grief therapy didn't seem to significantly help the average person. It did somewhat help the people who were having the most trouble coping, though, like if they're experiencing some of the complications we just talked about. But to be clear, we here at SciShow aren't health professionals, and everyone processes grief differently. So even though some research says therapy might help certain people more than others, it's not worth writing off completely. The good news, though, is that most people can move past their grief. Or at least they can move past the most difficult stage of it, known as acute grief. That's the really sucky part with all the physiological symptoms, where you're exhausted and your stomach feels empty, or you have a lump in your throat. Most people seem to be able to move beyond this in 3 to 6 months. They still miss their loved one, but they can get on living their lives. And plenty of researchers see establishing a lasting relationship with the deceased as part of coping. The thing is, grief really is a normal process. It can be really tough on the mind, but you'll get through it okay. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow. If you want to learn more about brains and
So as you can see, there's been a lot more research on grief and the stages of death and dying, as well as different responses to grief, than the book talks about exclusively. So with that, I think one of the biggest takeaways from that video and from the recent research on grief and the processes of death and dying are that people are generally really quite resilient, even if they're, say, suffering from depression before they find out that they're dying, or that they're suffering from depression even before the death of a close family member or something like that. People tend to be quite resilient and able to still do things that they need to do, take care of themselves, get food, take care of their jobs, take care of their children or pets or things like that. People tend to be really resilient and then be able to bounce back. It might take a while. For some people, it takes on average about maybe 3 to 6 months when knowing a family member, when say like a family member has died. If it goes beyond say 9 months, then that's when there's more recommendations to have like therapists or professional help step in. But just like that said, that might not be a bad idea right at the beginning as well. So people can be really resilient. People have different responses, but generally acceptance of one's own death tends to be one of the most common experiences. So people have a lot of media, a lot of these stages of grief and dying tend to like be kind of negative or looked at negatively. So like denial is seen as like a negative thing, or anger is seen as a negative thing. There's like kind of a negative value placed on it. When in reality, yes, some people might experience denial or might experience anger or might experience bargaining, but generally people have a fairly healthy reactions. Grief is a normal process. That denial is quite normal. Bargaining is quite normal. Anger is quite normal. And these aren't stages that people have to go through. You don't have to go through one to the other, to the other, to the other. You might only experience acceptance. Another person might only experience depression. Other person might only experience anger in facing their own death, right? Or you might jump between many different things. So there's a lot of different variables, a lot more research that has clarified the issue a lot. The popularity of these stages of grief make it hard. I don't know if they make it hard for more recent research to get into people's heads. I think also researchers sometimes, even myself, sometimes do a poor job at explaining our research and like the most up-to-date findings to people who don't know how to read science. So that's a problem that the field has in general. This is kind of a tangent. I wish my graduate training had included a writing class for scientific work, as well as a writing class for how to present material just to people in general. So things like YouTube videos or blogs could be discussed, and like how best to like deliver information to people. Yeah, that was a little more of a tangent than I expected to go on there, but relevant and important. So with that, the perceived control people have in the months or weeks leading up to dying can help people remain a lot more cheerful and can be a lot more adaptive. So denial can insulate and allows you to avoid coping with really intense feelings of anger or hurt. So it can be really helpful. So denying that this is happening to you, just trying to keep going on with life as normal, can be a helpful coping strategy. It's not necessarily just a bad thing, but it can be maladaptive depending on the extent. So if, for example, someone does not accept a life-saving operation, so if a doctor says, hey, you're dying in 3 weeks, but if you get this operation done in 1 week, you will live the rest of your life. If you're in denial that whole week and you say, no, 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 no operation, you miss that window, that's obviously maladaptive. So more than 80% of Americans die in hospitals and about 20% die in nursing homes. So hospitals offer the advantages of having professional staff who are trained to take care of people's health. Also, hospitals generally have a lot of technology to help prolong life, versus a nursing home doesn't tend to have as much technology, doesn't have as much staff to take care of acute chronic problems or chronic problems. Forgot a couple words in that sentence there. So one really important thing with humans in general is communicating. We've seen that in socio-emotional development throughout this entire course. So communicating with someone who's dying is also very essential. They don't lose that need to be around or with other people just because they're dying or that they're sad. It helps people close their lives in accord with their own ideas about proper dying. You can find out what they want, people that they want you to contact, what they want to be done. Let's say they haven't written a living will. If they're able to communicate what they want done, that's good at the end of their life, right? So you might be able to complete plans or help them complete projects that they were trying to do, make arrangements with family members about what should be done after they die. It gives them an opportunity, and you an opportunity as someone who's grieving with them, to reminisce and converse with them about their life. Helps them have a better understanding about what's happening to them. They can ask questions. So what's going to happen to me? Am I going to be able to breathe? Am I going to be in pain? What's going to happen after this operation? Those kinds of things. Being able to ask questions and find out what's going to happen to them can really decrease the anxiety. If they just don't know, then they're going however many days or weeks or months or years just stressed out before dying, and that doesn't sound like a fun time at all. So their book has a lot of really great tips actually on page about 420 on how to communicate with a dying person. So one is establish your presence. Some of these apply for some and not others. So obviously if someone is, say, hard of hearing, or it might be more important, or can't see very well, make sure you establish your presence. You don't want to just scare them to death, right? That's a really terrible joke. I really shouldn't have said that, and I'm almost going to laugh at myself about it, about having made the joke, and I should not have made the joke. Compose yourself, Professor Riches. Establish your presence. Oh, and there I go. I laugh at my other stupid joke about going to laugh at a terrible joke. Okay. So establish your presence. Let them know that you're there, whether you're knocking on a door, walking into their hospital room, or something like that. Speak at eye level with them. If they're lying on a bed, don't be towering over them. Get down on their level, similar to how you might talk with a child to connect with them. It's hard to connect with someone when you don't have that face-to-face contact and that eye contact. Don't be afraid to touch that person. Oftentimes people, especially in a hospital, are starved for human touch. The nurses are probably touching them to change IVs, check blood pressure, check temperature, those kinds of things. But they're not getting their hand held, they're not getting hugs, and people need these things. Most people need these things to feel care and concern and love. So oftentimes, especially in a hospital setting, you might be afraid of, say, bumping the machines or pinching an IV. Don't be afraid to touch people, but obviously be careful with what you're doing too. So you don't want to pull out their IV at the same time as you're giving them a hug. So, but don't be afraid to touch them. Just be careful about it. If they've got a broken arm, don't squeeze that arm, obviously. Things like that. Eliminate distractions. So if they're watching a TV, ask if you can turn it off. Ignore things like your phone or other small tasks that need to be done. So nurses do a good job at this. When you're communicating with a patient, if they have to come in and check temperatures or do tasks, they'll get it done really quick, and they'll be a minimal distraction. But any tasks that you have to do, just focus on that person who's dying, right? And what they need. So if they're frail, expect for that visit to be really short. So maybe plan for what you want to talk about or things like that, or things that you want to share, because that might be a short visit. As well, make sure that you schedule with people if possible. So if the hospital has specific hours, you can call the person in advance and say, hey, I want to come visit you. What time would be good? Because they might be sleeping at the same couple hours a day, and so if you come during that couple hours, you might not be able to see them, but it might be helpful to come right after they wake up and when they're feeling more awake, or they want you to come right after the nurses come, so you can have a better idea. So schedule with them is really good. If they're frail, expect it to be short. Don't insist on the person accepting their death or denying it. So don't try to move them or help them move to a different phase of those Kubler-Ross phases, because like we talked about, it's not a stage like thing. It's not you've got to do 1, 2, 3, 4. So don't try to make them do that. Allow them to express any kind of emotions that they have, whether it's anger, guilt, acceptance. Just allow them to express that. You don't have to try and take that and change it and turn it positive. You can let them be angry. You can let them feel upset. That's okay. So discuss the expected outcomes, the treatments that they're going to go through, any unfinished business, anything that they want to talk about the logistics of the event itself, and anything that they would like to be done after they're gone. Ask them if they want you to contact someone. Maybe they have a brother who they haven't talked to for a while and they want you to try and track them down or something like that, or if they want you to deliver a message to someone. Encourage them to reminisce about things. So don't encourage them to try and not be angry or not feel guilty or to get to acceptance, but do encourage them to reminisce, especially remind them about things, memories you have together. Ask them about times or things that were important to them. Help them enjoy that reminiscing. Make an appointment, we talked about that. Express your regard, your care, your concern. Don't be afraid to express that you love them, and don't be afraid to say goodbye. So that's one thing that people who might go see a dying person, they might be like, oh, I want to come and see them again soon. That's fine. If you want to plan with them, you can even say, hey, I'm planning to come see you again tomorrow at this time. Would that be good? If it's possible that, or even if it's a slight possibility that they might die in between that time. Don't be afraid to say goodbye to them that time, and a second time, and a third time, right? So that's one thing that a lot of people feel guilt about not doing when they are surviving and they're living with the grief of someone passing, is that they didn't say goodbye or they didn't express how they felt about them. So do express your regard for that person. Don't be afraid to say goodbye. So grief is that emotional numbness, that disbelief, separation anxiety, that despair, that sadness that often accompanies the loss of someone that we love. So it's usually, like that video talked about, usually lasts for a couple months, and it can be really painful. It can hurt a lot. Older adults who were bereaved have more dysregulated cortisol patterns. So cortisol is that stress hormone. So it was a little more dysregulated when they're older. College students who had peers die in a traumatic way, specifically a shooting, had PTSD symptoms about 4 months later, and severe grief about 1 year later. So that's something definitely to get in treatment for, things like that. Cognitive factors, I tried to put cognitive and factors together as one word. Cognitive factors are involved in the severity of grief. So it will really vary greatly how any one person deals with grief. So prolonged grief disorder is generally considered having this kind of intense emotions associated with grief, even 6 months after the event, and difficulty moving on with life. Like you might not be able to, or a person experiencing prolonged grief disorder might not be able to get normal things done, daily tasks. They might believe life is empty without that deceased person and feel their future has no meaning. They might have panic attacks. They're probably suffering from depression. And they're not able to get daily tasks done. They might not be able to succeed at work or even get into work. So that is something to get treated and watch for in family members as well. Disenfranchised grief is when your grief is involving a deceased person that's a little socially ambiguous or can't be necessarily openly mourned or supported. Generally, people do a pretty good job if you tell them your grandparent died or your dog died or your sister died or your mother died or something. People understand that and will try to comfort you and understand the grief associated with that. But when it's something like an ex-spouse or an abortion or a death due to, say, suicide or AIDS, people just on average don't necessarily do as good of a job at understanding why you would grieve that. So it can be difficult for grieving those kinds of events. And it might be more intense because it can't be publicly acknowledged, because that's not in the social rules to be able to have grief about an abortion. But it is perfectly acceptable to have grief about that. It is perfectly acceptable to have grief about an ex-spouse's injury, hurt, death, things like that. So death impacts the survivors strongly, and it's really influenced by death's characteristics. So sudden deaths have more intense and prolonged effects on survivors. So if, say, family members died in a sudden car crash or something like that, that tends to leave more intense and prolonged effect on survivors, as opposed to, say, someone who is ill and you know a month or two in advance that they're going to be dying, and you can prepare and talk to them and go through some of these processes communicating with the person who is dying. So survivors may develop PTSD from being a survivor after this kind of intense event. They might not even necessarily be part of that event, but just having family members who die in that kind of sudden or intense way. So sleep problems are common, flashbacks, nightmares, concentration problems. Children's deaths can be really difficult for parents. So that one is something I feel like society generally understands, is that children's deaths can be really difficult. But here we're talking about the impact on survivors, so that can tend to be more intense than, say, the death of a grandparent. So grieving stimulates individuals to try and make sense of their world. Reliving events leading to the death is really common. Doing things you did with that person who has died is really common. When the death is caused by an accident or a disaster, the effort to make it make sense is often a lot more vigorous. So people might turn to religion or try to understand. So if it was a natural disaster like an earthquake, someone might do a lot to study up on earthquakes, study up on earthquake safety, to try and make sense of that and try to protect other people from it, things like that. Meaning making involves a couple different things. So sense making, figuring out explanations of death, medical explanations, figuring out the definitions of death, those kinds of things. Benefit finding, so is there possible benefits to someone's death? Are they no longer in pain? This is one that that's pretty common to hear. Oh, well, that person's not in pain anymore. So that's a benefit that they found. Continuing bonds, being able to, say, have a locket with pictures of a person, or a home video, or a letter that they wrote, or a picture, or something that reminds you of them, helps you continue that bond with the person even though they're no longer around. Then identity reconstruction. So especially if this is, say, a parent who lost a child, a spouse who lost a partner, reconstructing your identity again, so this is kind of a theme throughout the lifespan, is our identity is quite fluid over time. So we might now need to restructure our identity based on our new context. So the death of an intimate partner does tend to bring profound grief. Widows tend to outnumber widowers because women on average live longer than men. So with that, about 14% of women age 85 to 74 years old were widows, 31 at 75 to 84 years old, and about 59% of women 85 years and over were widows. So maybe something to prepare for and realize. So widowed women are probably the poorest group in the U.S., so in socioeconomic status. Many widows are also very lonely and benefit a lot from social support. So something to be aware of to support people in maybe even your immediate neighborhood. So with that, in a study of US, England, Europe, Korea, and China, depression peaked in about the first year of widowhood for women and men. So widowed women recovered to levels compared to married individuals in all of these countries, and widowed men continued to have high levels of depression even 6 to 10 years post-widowhood everywhere except for Europe. So becoming widowed is associated with about a 48% increase in an early death. So community supports, social supports are very important for people who are widows or widowers. So funerals are really, well, let's talk about multiple forms of mourning, and we'll focus a lot on funerals. So funerals and other forms of mourning are really important in different cultures on how you practice mourning, remember that person. So in the US, a lot of funerals are conducted privately and followed by some kind of memorial ceremony. But depending on religions, cultures, beliefs, ideas, they might be very, very different. So as an example, I hope my funeral involves people that are really close to me, pouring my ashes somewhere that's important to me. If it's possible, I'd actually like it to be somewhere in the Uinta Mountains, which is in Utah, at a place where I went camping a lot. So that would be cool. And they know that. The people that are closest to me know that. So that would be a lot different than maybe what you would want or someone else would want. So this is another thing to talk about with people beforehand. And this really helps people mourn, doing the wishes, those final wishes of the person that they cared about, thinking about the person, being with other people who cared about the person. It's really important for humans. So in some cultures, a ceremonial meal is shared after death. Black armbands for bereaved family members for a year following a death. So there's a wide variety of kind of traditions around mourning. In the Amish culture, a community handles, virtually everything in general in an Amish community, but also all aspects of the funeral as well. So that is actually the last piece in chapter 17 we're going to cover. I want to now completely shift gears and do a little bit of a review of some of the things we started this class with. So in chapter 1, we talked about the lifespan perspective and a couple of these points. So now that we've reached the end of life, I want to review some of these main critical components that hopefully you can tie to different pieces and facts and studies and examples throughout the course of the semester. So development happens continuously from conception to death. Again, that involves growth, maintenance, and decline as well. So a lot of physical growth is happening even up to this point, and then cognitive growth can still keep happening even into old age, maintenance of cognitive faculties as well in older age, things like that. So development is lifelong. So we've learned a lot about development in middle adulthood, late adulthood. We've emphasized these maybe more than your book does as well. Development is not just until we get to be adults. It's a lifelong process. It's multidimensional. So that means there's lots of different dimensions. Your physical development, our chapters have been broken up into physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development. But we have our biology, our health, our temperament, our personality, our identity, our cognition. All of these things are different dimensions that develop, that either are growing or being maintained in different ways at all different times in our lifespan. Multidirectional. Some things are growing, some things are staying the same, some things are shrinking away. So some examples we gave at the very beginning of class that hopefully make more sense to you now are language processing. So when we're really young, it's really easy to learn language. When we're an adolescent or an adult, it's a lot harder to learn a new language. Cognitive abilities, we don't reach our full cognitive capacity or full brain capacity. Maybe poor choice of words there. The brain isn't fully neurologically developed and myelinated until about age 23, and so with that, even after that, we're still developing new cognitive abilities. So a lot of growth happening and then maintenance of cognitive abilities. So just like a tree might be growing leaves or sustaining its leaves, losing leaves, or growing its trunk in, say, the winter. So development, hopefully you see, is relatively plastic. So we can change a lot over the course of the lifespan. There's not just change in childhood, there's not just change in adolescence, there's change in adulthood, there's change in middle adulthood, there's change in late adulthood. There can even be a lot of changes, whether they're losses or growths, in late adulthood. So hopefully you understand that, especially cognitively, we have a lot of capacity for growing all throughout the lifespan. I think it's a pretty optimistic view and look at humans. I think the developmental look and the lifespan look is really optimistic about what humans can and do achieve. It's multidisciplinary, so a lot of the studies we've talked about come from medicine, come from sociology, come from psychology. So there's a lot of different fields that look at the development of humans. Development is contextual. We've talked about a lot of different contexts. Someone's learning to ride a motorcycle right outside my house. Ooh. I feel like I should go help them. Help them learn. If you've ever seen those videos of people who just release the clutch, release the clutch just too much as they're giving it too much fuel and the bike flipping or crashing, that was this close to happening just now. So I don't know, they might not appreciate if I came out to try and help them. Also, I probably shouldn't. I'm in quarantine right now. But I'll watch. Sorry. Development is very contextual. So you've got your community supports. So we saw that a lot of this research, especially towards the end of life, and even with children and adolescents, a lot of things can influence a child from their immediate community, those things that they can immediately be affected by. But culture is also an important part, as well as a society in general. But people are changing and affecting their own context. So a child can influence their parents, an adult child can influence their adult parents, and that adult parent can influence that adult child and change how they're perceiving one another, make changes in their personalities, their identities, how they feel about each other, the choices they make in life. So development is bidirectional interaction in a lot of different ways. So development is a lot of the things, you might say all the things. So, focuses of developmental research, we've touched on a lot of different topics: health, well-being, culture, diversity, parenting, education. Humans thriving is one of my key things that I've tried to get across throughout this course. Social policy is relevant to human development. Technology is relevant to human development. And the systems theories. So, Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory and model of development. This is one of the modern and most useful, especially if you're going to go forward in developmental psychology. One of the biggest theories you should have some better idea for. If you want some of the original papers on this, let me know. It's easy to find though. If you're using Google Scholar as well, you now have those skills to do that. So relational developmental systems theory is learners' take on this. So those bidirectional interactions, it being multidisciplinary and context mattering. And so let's look back at this graph I showed you, or diagram that I showed you near the beginning of the class. So we have these this is what applied psychologists like myself do. We see a socially significant problem. Maybe it's the lack of good end-of-life care for older adults. So we do applied research to solve the problem. What's being done? What do we know about the end of life? What do people want out of the end of life? We get out into the real world. We test out some things, or we ask people in the community, practitioners, people in nursing homes, people doing hospice care, Nurses, what people need. We ask them what they need. We look at theory. We do more research. We use proper research methods. We learn some things, and then we deliver that knowledge to people that care about it. Researchers, those nurses, those hospice workers. Maybe we solved the problem. We created the perfect program for helping people towards the end of life. Probably not. We might have created one good program towards the end of life, but then we send that back into basic research. We write papers, we change policies, get more funding for end-of-life care. We do evaluations, and then we do this cycle of getting out in the real world, solving problems with research in psychology. We work with people who care, multidisciplinary people, health workers, hospice workers, nurses, family members. And then hopefully we can solve problems through what we know about lifespan development and the expertise of other people in other fields. So that's what applied psychology does. That's what I try to do. That's what I'm hopefully encouraging you to think about as a possibility for your future, if that's something you want to do, as well as an idea of what do psychologists actually do. Applied psychologists try to solve problems in the world, from how can we support children who are neurodivergent to what can we do to support people in their end of life. So that is, and another thing, we've talked about this almost every single lecture, so probably be on the final. So this idea of developmental cascades, that people have risk factors as well as protective factors. So things that are risk factors might send you towards, say, some negative outcomes, versus things that are protective factors might send you towards some positive outcomes. We can, as people, with other people around us, we can help create protective factors for people in our lives. We can be a social support. We can help create better programs for people that help them, so that we can have more human thriving. So that's one of the key focuses of lifespan development. I hope you've learned and at least have a better understanding of a lot of those points through this course. I'm glad that we were able to cover so much detail about the chapters in these videos. It is unfortunate in these kinds of videos we're not able to ask questions back and forth as students and professor, but hopefully you did learn a lot, and some of these things have been internalized and you have a better idea about lifespan development, and it'll help you in your own lifespan as well. Oh, neurons. Yeah, I kept that picture. Probably the wrong place, but definitely review neurons before the final, and neurology in general. So thank you very much. I enjoy lifespan development. That's why I am an applied developmental scientist. That's why this is what I do. So thanks very much for going through this course with me and learning about lifespan development, and good luck.